that we had to specifically include, which incorporated small farm certification and defining what a small farm is for the purpose of certification, nutrient storage, soil health, buffer zone, livestock exclusion, and nutrient management requirements. And then in the future, in 2018, we will be looking to revise the RAPs to incorporate some tile drainage, which there are 2 reports that the agency is responsible to do with the Agency of Natural Resources. The interim report was due this year for tile drainage, and it's available on the Agency of Ag's website. And then next January, there'll be a final report with recommendations on tile drain for the final report. The one change this legislative session was the timeline for finishing these RAPs, or at least filing these RAPs. Previous, it was July date, and now it is September 15th of 2016. And that was mutually agreed upon. We've done a lot of outreach and education about the RAPs. There's been a lot of interest in folks providing comment. We've gone through a great deal of comment and made substantial edits along the way. So this feedback for us was a really great opportunity. And from other folks' interest, it helped give opportunity to make sure that there was more involvement at a time where farm operations are quite busy. The next slide here shows the timeline. This is really blown out, but I'll give you an opportunity to look at it more detailed. But generally what it shows you is we've been doing this for quite a while. We've been doing this since last October. And at this point, we are in the process of, we've filed the rule with LCAR. Ryan, do you mind moving that so that I can see? Sorry, excuse me. And so ICAR, excuse me, filed it with ICAR, and basically that process kicks off rulemaking. And you'll see that following that, we have put a draft of this up on our website, and we have also listed some hearing dates, which I'll show you. But that process basically allows us to start talking about it, getting input. There is a formal public period where we'll have comment, and you can see that. It has already started in our minds, and it closes July 7th. And we will take comments. At the end of this presentation, you'll see ways that you can get comments to us, but email is obviously one, phone calls with staff, and just one-on-one in person. We certainly are interested in any comment that people have, and we can formally put it in through the process. And the final process will be, if you come to one of these hearings, and this is where the record will be set, is there's an opportunity to sit down, and it's recorded, and to have your input put on the record for these rules. So there was a press release. Hopefully the information went out very widely, that people are aware that this final draft is up. Our intention is that this is the final draft until the actual final that comes out of this process. It may have been confusing. This is the 3rd iteration of this, but this is the final one we're going to set before the official formal rulemaking or public comment process, and then the last and final draft will be it, hopefully. Once we get through this process and we close the public comment period on July 7th, we will then take all of that input and revise the RAPs, which is the blue period, which is about a month. Once we get through that process of taking in all that comment, we'll then file it with LCAR, the Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules. They have 45 days to go through their process, but they can extend it. If they don't extend it, it's likely that the RAPs would be finalized in October. However, if they do choose to make an extension, it could go as late as into January. These are the public hearing dates that we've set up. We've chosen to do 5 around the state, and there is a 6th one that we're doing, actually, isn't there, down in Manchester, Vermont, and so that is available up on our website. But unfortunately, I apologize, we hadn't updated the slide. It was an after the fact, after we had already published all of this. We got enough feedback from folks saying that there wasn't a meeting that was well represented for the southern portion of the state, and so we added one more in Manchester, Vermont. All right. So details to be found on the website for that one. Ryan just let me know we're still in the process of actually scheduling it and finalizing it, so stay tuned. So a reminder that this is an all-in approach. This is a conversation about what we're doing in agriculture around the RAPs and improvements to the RAPs, but all of these other sectors are also actively engaged in some process now, whether increasing regulations that existed previously or creating new regulations. This is a handout that we've created. It's also available on our website because we recognize how confusing a lot of this is and where all the pieces of all these puzzles fit together. And essentially what this document, I recognize you probably can't read it at the level that it's at, but it tries to overlay how the Act 64, the TMDL, and then all the initiatives, including the revision of the RAPs, to the tile drain report that I mentioned, to voluntary programs that try and provide incentives like the Conservation Partnership Program or the Environmental Stewardship Program. So this little visual here tries to pull all that together and explain all of the different things that are going on through the Agency of Ag and partners that are working with the Agency of Agriculture. An additional reminder is that the process of doing these RAPs, they're the regulatory process, but there's also a lot of effort trying to be pushed into making sure that technical assistance and financial assistance is increased in the state and available to farmers to be able to do projects. Some of the work that we've learned as we've gone out and done the North Lake Farm Survey is that a lot of farms are not aware or have never utilized these types of resources. And so we're trying to put more effort into getting that outreach and connectivity through contracted work and partnerships to help farms understand how to go through the process. And all of these kinds of pieces of information can be found. Our website has been completely revised, and there's information in the research section, there's information in the news and events sections that can really help people put together all of the different things that are actively going on in the Agency of Agriculture and sometimes with partnerships beyond just these RAPs. But I will say that the RAP website itself on the Agency of Ag's website is phenomenal and has a great deal of information. And as we go forward, it will continue to be the warehouse where we'll put responsiveness summaries, et cetera, from this process. So when you go to our website, one thing you'll notice is that the new rules that are up, the draft ones, they're really clear at what date they were put up, and these are the May 13th. So the document you should be looking at for the next couple of months is this May 13th draft to provide comments to when you come to a hearing. So let's get into the details. The big question that we were tasked with doing is defining a small farm, and specifically farms and what size would be required to do annual certification. We took that a little bit of a step further and decided that there were actually separations that made sense to work with the municipal sector and have a group of operations that are small enough in size that when you look at all of the other restrictions in the RAP, such as the manure siting setbacks and nutrient management standards, these operations are small enough that they really are local matters and felt that zoning and local control could be a better resource for these types of operations. And so you can see that first group in the blue is the non-RAP group, which means that these rules would not apply to them. And that includes, for example, it's those with less than 4 acres and 1 to 4 cows, as an example. Or they do not profit more than $2,000 from working the operation, the agricultural operation that they have on their site. One thing that is a big change from the last draft to this draft is there was no backstop. If a town had no interest in working with this type of operation, there was only the only backstop was that the DEC can do an inspection. We've since said that if there is a water quality issue, maybe it's not a direct discharge, but it is a water quality issue, the Agency of Agriculture will still retain coverage of those farms. And what we would do is pull them into the next group, which is the RAP Small Farm Operation Group. So declare them a small farm, because in statute, that's one of the things we can do is declare a farm to fit into a group. based on water quality issues. So there is now a backstop there to make sure that water quality is protected. However, in the future, we will be working, if this goes through, with towns and helping provide them support to give them input on our best technical judgment of how to manage these operations based on our experience and what they might want to consider. So that will be something going forward as this moves on. This RAP small farm group is the group there that does not have to certify, but they do have to follow these rules, which is essentially today's standard, right? The RAPs apply to all farms today. So it's no change other than the revisions that are in this specific draft. And we've separated that group from those that have to certify by saying that these farms, they're bigger than 4 acres, but they're not bigger than 10 acres. And so there's a separation there. And then, you know, the animal types also go along with that. So once you become certified, it's when you have, if you're using dairy cow as the example, is you have 10 acres and you have more than 50 head of cow, mature cows. One thing is that if a farm operation, there can be many small farm operations, you know, 6 acres, say, that make more than $2,000 or have an approved business plan. And those farms there, they can make justification. Sorry, let me back up. That they can be less than 4 acres, but they make more than $2,000 a year, or they want to have a prospective business plan to do so. They can ask to be regulated by the Agency of Agriculture under these rules, even though by definition today they fall under non-RAP. They can request to the agency to be put under the RAP because they can define that they meet these requirements that categorize that topic. So again, making more than $2,000 annual gross income, or filing a 1040-F for the last 2 years. So it's just demonstrating that they are an agricultural operation and should be managed by the Agency of Agriculture. On the very left, you'll see the estimated number of farms that we believe fall in these categories. And so for that RAP small farm category, we think there's 5,500 farms that fall into that category. For the certified farms, you'll see there's about 1,500 that we believe fall into this category. And one thing we did was we separated this out a little bit more. The types of operations that exist, so there's livestock, obviously, but there's also more broad cropland farms, so we've called them annual cropland farms, and vegetable farms. And we've broken them down a little bit more detailed based on a lot of input from multiple different stakeholders. And we found that this definition seems to work pretty well. So for livestock and the dairy cow, I already went over the 50 head. One thing we changed on the livestock was increasing the live weight number. It was previously 60,000 pounds, and we moved it up to 90,000 pounds. And that was to align with that. The largest animal count there you'll see is the 75 beef cows as the low number, and that would equate roughly to the 90,000 pounds. So just creating a level understanding of weight versus what the requirement is for the highest number animal. And as a reminder, all of these numbers in this category come from a percentage of, they come from what EPA has done. They did a thorough assessment of defining numbers for CAFO, and then we've just taken a percentage of those numbers to come up with this set of number. So I believe it was 20% of what a medium CAFO is where this number ended up. For annual cropland, we said 50 acres, and in statute it says, you know, certified farms must be at least 10 acres or more. But when we looked at that, and we got a great deal of feedback that was a lot of farms and a lot of requirements, and may not be the biggest nutrient source, for instance. And so looking at where land holdings and operation management is much larger, so 50 acres or more, where they're really plowing larger swaths, applying nutrients at a broader scale, that is where we've said, let's draw the line there. So for annual cropland, which includes feed corn, sweet corn, pumpkins, and soybeans, we've said, those are just examples, but we've said that anyone who's operating that much land collectively in their farm for those types of production would have to certify annually. For vegetable farms, it's the same threshold, 50 acres or more. For medium and large farms, those are already regulated by the Agency of Agriculture. There's no change in the definition for those two farms. However, the inspection cycles, just as a reminder, did change for medium farms in Act 64, and it had gone from 5-year minimum inspection cycle to 3-year minimum inspection cycle. So we will be on those farms more often. For those small non-RAP farms, again, they have to manage parcels less than 4 acres in size, and you can see there's and the animal numbers that go with it. And this listing gives you the animal numbers that go with it. And as a reminder, this hasn't changed, and it comes from the current definition of a farm structure in the current RAPs. Historically, towns have been able to manage farm structures, but they've never been able to manage the activity. And so this change just basically is allowing the local municipality to manage the activity going on that land in addition to the structure. I think we've covered everything else through here, through this slide. And just a reminder that the Agency of Agriculture has the backstop where if there's a water quality issue, we can pull those farms into becoming RAP farms. This is just a different breakdown. When you get into who is a small farm is defined that has to certify, we wanted to show you some more statistics about where we drew these lines, again, based on a lot of feedback. The left column shows you the percentage of the particular type that is captured by that definition. And so for livestock, for instance, the definition that we've laid out, it's 76.4% of all the live weight of animals. And when you look at the dairy industry, it's 94% of all of the dairy cows in Vermont. So we felt like that was really comprehensive of getting at the group that generates the substantial amount of manure and has land base that is utilizing that manure and making sure that those are managed appropriately. For annual cropland, you can see it gets 93% of all corn for silage in the state of Vermont. And vegetable, it gets 68% of all vegetable acreage. So those get substantial amounts of land holdings that really want to make sure that the erosion is captured and that, again, nutrients are managed appropriately. And this is also, those numbers, just for reference, are not just the small farms, it is small, medium, and large. So it's not that something's being left out in that group, but once you overlay certification, medium farm, and large farm regulations, all of those that have to report annually and meet higher standards, which I'll show you in a minute, that's the percentages there that are covered. So once a small farm is required to certify, these are the requirements. And the only change on this slide, if you've seen this presentation material before, is the minimum inspection cycle went from 10 years to 7 years. And that is because we raised the limit on who has to certify to a higher number of animals, for instance, or cropland. And it reduced the amount of farms that are required to certify, which then can allow our staff to do inspections more often. So we reduced it to a 7-year cycle. But when you're a certified small farm, the expectation is that you'll do an annual compliance report that'll give us a big overall summary of your farm and your management. You have to have a nutrient management plan that meets the federal requirements, called the 590 standard. And then you have to do education. And you have to do 4 hours of education every 8 years. And one clarification is that we reread the requirements in Act 64 about notifying the Agency of Ag about a transfer of ownership. And we really interpreted that, I think incorrectly the first time we went out and talked about it, saying that if you had a piece of land that you were to change lease or ownership of, but really re-looking at it, it's a whole farm. So when a farm decides to sell, a small certified farm decides to sell, they need to notify the Agency of Ag. That way we can transfer the certification requirement to the new farm or void it if it's no longer going to be in farming. So just a reminder, no one should have a discharge on any farm. This has been in the federal and state law for many, many years. And these are just two examples of very clear, direct, connective waste from either a production area, like this heavy use area where you can see it's the edge of a silage bunk, and so you can see the waste feed on the photo on the left there, right going into a ditch that goes into a main tributary. And the picture on the right is a manure pit, and you can see the trail of it overtopping right into a stream. These are things that no one should have on their farm, and certainly if you have risk of this, please reach out to some of those financial resources to try and start working on a plan to correct it. For production areas, one major change, so where you store things, basically, manure storages, one of the last drafts talked about having at least 1 foot of freeboard in your manure pit. And we've changed that because we had a lot of feedback that said, well, what if I always have 9 inches? Is that okay? You know, are you going to make me redo my whole manure pit? And we revised it to say that you have to maintain it to prevent overflow. And so it gives us that opportunity to look at how much waste you're generating, look at the opportunities and risks that exist, and to be able to work with you to get that taken care of before it causes a problem. And there may be manure pits out there that are not in good shape, and we may require that they bring them up to standard. And so that is just more clearly laid out into this whole revision of the RAPs versus the previous current version. For field stacking, one of the changes that we've made is this, you recall, and if you followed the draft, we had started with 4 different siting locations and moving the material. At this point, this draft, what it says is that field stacks can be managed, but they have to be removed every 2 years. So that allows, we heard a lot about needing to compost, having longer times, or even just, it's not a lot of manure and the person comes every 2 years because of the management that goes on. And as long as it's not creating a discharge or having a high risk of we need to prevent it before it becomes a discharge, then that will work. One thing that we also heard is, well, NRCS set this up, or Agency of Ag told me to stack this here at some point because it was a good site to stack at. If you've got an approval from one of those 2 authorities, then that is fine, and we will accept that. Otherwise, and those authorities, just so you know, have typically been greater than the setback standards that exist here, which is why that they would meet these standards that we're proposing today, which are 100 feet from property lines, 200 feet from the top of bank of surface water, 200 feet from a public or a private well, and then 100 feet from ditches or conveyance to surface water. And then also the public water supply, 200 feet from there. One thing that we cannot do, so we can give the ability to authorize something less than some of these standards, but for surface water or wells, we cannot go less than 200 feet. So some of these farms, they're older infrastructure built obviously well before the idea of regulations such as these. They need to work within the infrastructure that they've got, and so we can work with that so long as we can demonstrate that there's not a water quality issue and a risk. But again, for surface water and well, we cannot approve anything less than 100 feet. For nutrient management, there are 2 levels of standards that exist in this draft. One is those RAP farms that do not have to certify essentially have to do what they have to do today, which is take soil tests, apply at agronomic rates, and we much more clearly define that they have to keep records. And the agency has created a record-keeping booklet that is available to help you do that if you needed that type of assistance. For certified farms and medium and large farms, the requirement would be that 590 nutrient management standard, which is the federal requirement. For soil health, which was something that was outlined, if you recall, in that first slide that Act 64 required the agency to do, we're still saying the same things, but we've done one clarification on what the definition is of frequently flooded. So for gully erosion, you've got to manage it. And for soil loss, the standard is proposed to be T. The current standard is 2T, so it's cutting soil loss in half for the small farms. The medium and large farms already meet T. And T is the 590 nutrient management standard requirement as well as managing field-borne gully erosion. So those 2 things are already embedded in the other requirements so that they all sort of fit together. For cover cropping, what we've said is that floodplains have to be cover cropped. And there's 2 different dates, broadcasting by October 1 or drilling by October 15th. And the reason for that is the differential in seed-soil contact. You can get better germination if you drill it at a later date to where broadcast is not as effective at a later date. Certainly every year is different, but some data that's come out more locally has shown us that these are pretty consistent and allow us to manage. We had gotten, these dates before were earlier, if you recall, and we got a lot of feedback asking for geographic differentials for different dates, or even just elevation differences, you know, managing lowlands versus managing up high towards the mountains. There's a difference in the temperature. But what we said was we'll push it back and make one universal statewide date, and hopefully that gives everyone an opportunity to meet those requirements. I'll give you a definition of what this soil survey flooding class, we've defined it as frequently flooded, is the land that's required to meet this requirement. And part of this came about, folks wanted to know, we just said on floodplains, and there was no good definition of what a floodplain is, and so there was a lot of requests for defining that, and we did define it. We've added into a 30% crop residue. So some floodplains have still crops standing, whether it's vegetables or grain corn, for instance, or soybeans, still standing on these October dates. And so we've said that if you don't actually plant a cover crop, a winter cover crop, you could just have residue be the standard. So as long as you can maintain 30% residue. The definition here in this photo shows you what frequently flooded means. The one thing that was nice about this layer, we went through all the different resources that might be available to map and geographically look at and identify where floodplains might exist. And the only thing that we found that was statewide and consistent was this frequently flooded layer that comes from floodable soils defined by NRCS. And where the 100-year floodplain is mapped, it does align really well with that. And the unfortunate thing is the 100-year floodplain isn't always mapped for some of the smaller tributaries to where these soil maps are. But that's the goal, is that the frequently flooded areas are the ones that need the cover cropping. And some folks have asked us, well, what if just a portion of my field has that? The expectation is only that portion needs to have the cover crop. However, managing as blocks obviously makes more sense in many instances, and we certainly encourage that. But the idea is that during those shoulder seasons where the risk is highest of flood, we want to make sure that those soils are protected and that the nutrients that were put down are utilized by the growing crop there. For winter and floodplain applications, you know, the winter spreading ban is still in the RAPs. That's not changed as far as a general standard. However, there are some additions to it. So December 15th to April 1st is the current standard. However, it was actually 2 years ago the agency got the authority from the legislature to extend the ban starting December 1st, so 2 weeks earlier, or postponing it an entire month all the way out to April 30th. And the reason for that was there are some years where it could be that the weather is so poor that it really is not conducive and would be a nutrient impact to be spreading manure during those time periods. The agency got a lot of feedback on, you know, when are you going to declare that? How are you going to notice it? And we put in there that we will do adequate notice. And so we're working on developing listservs. We're working on expanding our outreach and working with partners to be able to get information out more broadly and more quickly. And we want to utilize all those tools. We would use newspapers, obviously, to notice things. And for instance, we've done like WCAX type stuff. So we will use all the channels we have if ever we were to utilize this extension of the ban, and well in advance as we could of those dates. We can still issue emergency exemptions. Those are only limited to truly the sense of the word emergency, not a lack of management leading up to the ban. And so, you know, examples of that are if there's a structural failure going on or something much more serious, sometimes frozen pipes and things break and you need to lower the level of the manure pit to be able to access and correct the problem. So, you know, we're definitely open to trying to work with farmers when there's emergency situations to alleviate any impacts. The first thing that we do is try and see if there's another manure pit where the material could be moved and stored. However, if there are no alternatives, then we can issue an exemption where we would allow manure spreading during the winter with restrictions. Manure still needs to be injected or incorporated within 48 hours. That's the current requirement, and it doesn't apply to no-till land. So for the frequently flooded fields, again, that same definition of the layer that I just showed you, manure has to be applied before October 15th. And so basically we're saying that fall manure application on these flood fields, these frequently flooded fields, needs to occur earlier. We're also saying that it needs to occur a little bit later. The reason for this, and that is basically, the April 15th, is to make sure that these fields are protected where there's a high risk of the runoff. There are years where the mountains still have snow on them, the main flood has still not come through, and we just want to make sure that people are postponing and making sure that that time period has passed where the risk is gone. One thing we've done in the past is where the weather's great, we have listed bans early, where we know that there wasn't a heavy snowpack, it's already gone past the melt, temperatures are great, predictions look great in the future, to allow people to go ahead and move earlier. So again, there's a lot of communication between us and the ag community about these particular dates and restrictions. However, the goal is to set these dates so that you can manage around them, and then we'll work where there's opportunities. One opportunity that exists is basically in the winter time. In New York, for instance, they allow winter manure application on select fields. Excuse me. And so the agency was given the ability to allow winter manure spreading exemptions to be in place as part of a nutrient management plan. So where they're predefined fields, sorry about that, Samantha, we're not sure what happened there, but we're back online. Where you can identify fields that aren't near water, flat, all of the things that you can think of for water quality that would reduce the risk of any impacts, we can pre-plan those in a nutrient management plan done by a certified nutrient management planner, again, that meets that 590 nutrient management standard and are incorporated in the whole nutrient balance for that field. So that is something that we can do as long as it's pre-planned, and annually the records will be sent into the agency, and we would decide whether to continue to allow that practice if it's being managed well. When weather events are imminent and well-known, we want to try and manage it so that people are not spreading manure ahead of these types of events. So taking that into consideration. And we got a lot of comments based on, sometimes it drops 4 inches literally out of nowhere on one site, but not the next town. And so how do you manage that type of weather pattern when you get these pop-up thunderstorms and the chance of rain was only 30%? That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about widespread rain events that are known to be coming. And the real issue is that when we get to the site, the manure or waste, whatever was applied, is moving off the site into water. That's the crux that we didn't clarify well enough last time, is that you've created a water quality impact that is visible, and then you can look at the weather pattern and recognize that the activity and the weather were all well known, and this could have been avoided had the manure been delayed after the weather pattern had already passed. This also goes for, so I just described basically like a rain event, but it also goes for spreading on frozen or saturated ground, knowing that it could release and thaw and the weather is going to be warm for the next couple of days. That also is an activity, is just let that snow melt, let the time pass, and then do a manure application before doing it on frozen or saturated ground. So no manure on frozen, saturated ground or bedrock that is exposed. Two big things that we had talked about in the previous drafts are soil test phosphorus when it's 20 parts per million or greater, and the management of how we deal with that. 20 parts per million is excessive. And what we've seen in data is that as the soil test phosphorus continues to increase, so does the risk of losses to runoff, and if it's tile drained, it increases the risk of loss through tile drains. And so what we'd like to put in place here is a management strategy that the farm outlines, that they state how they're going to work towards reducing some of those legacy phosphorus loads. So soil test phosphorus, it doesn't go down immediately, and the crop has to continue to take that soil phosphorus out of the soil. And so we're looking for a farm to set up a strategy. So maybe that's, your current plan might be that you're doing spring and fall manure application. Maybe your future plan is you do just spring application. You don't do fall application. So you start to limit the amount of manure that goes onto that particular field. Alternatives too could be different feeding strategies to reduce the manure content, wider buffers. There's different things that you can do to help alleviate some of the losses of phosphorus from the field when it gets excessive. The 10% slope was another matter that we discussed, and saying no manure application on annual cropland without a 100-foot grass buffer and manure setback. So basically, to define that with clarity for this draft, if an average field has a slope of 10% or greater, and it has a surface water on it or adjacent to it, you need to have a buffer of 100 foot along that entire, and by that buffer I mean like a grassed buffer, along that whole segment of surface water along that field. And you cannot spread manure in that 100 foot. If that field in itself really has areas that are much lower risk and that slope is in one portion of the field versus the whole field, you can ask the Agency of Agriculture for a site-specific buffer determination. And that's where we can go out and we can look at the risk and make a decision on where the buffer should be 100 feet and where it could be reduced. But it's only, again, on annual cropland, which has a specific definition to not be lands that, like what we talked about, some of the small grains are not included. It's really specifically land that is more broadly plowed and planted annually. So buffers and setbacks, again, Agency of Agriculture, there's lots of terms that people use for the word buffer. For us, it is always and continues to mean a grass perennial vegetative buffer, so a planting that is sufficient to manage and be, it can't have channelized flow through it, for instance. It can't just be weeds that are not well managed. It really needs to be a thick, more sod-like buffer. But in those buffers, we also expect that manure is not applied. So we've kept them continuous, where if you are required to have a certain setback distance of a buffer, that often means you shouldn't be putting manure in that same setback. So this draft of the RAPs outlines that surface waters, which are streams, should have a 25-foot setback, and ditches, which are not streams by definition, but they can dry up and they drain water, they have to be buffered by 10 feet. And that includes roadside ditches, which is a big difference from where management is today. Right now, ditches do not have to have any buffers unless they are considered a significant contributor, which that is of nutrients. And that is something that we've added into this draft, is basically there are some ditches that really do function, they're highly functioning to move water and potentially move nutrients. And those can be required under the RAPs, no matter what size farm, to be extended up to 25 feet. And so that is something that is actually in the 590 nutrient management standard, but in this case would apply to all farms that are regulated by the RAPs, where, for instance, you've got a field that's draining down into a site, or the ditch itself has had so much flow put into it from land management changes that it flows continuously and throughout the year, acting more like a stream or a surface water. You can harvest the vegetation in a buffer, and you can utilize fertilizer or compost, but not raw manure. And you need to take a soil test and demonstrate that it does need nutrients prior to applying those nutrients, and then keeping records of all of that. And the reason that we made that change is, obviously if you're harvesting it, you're taking nutrients out of it. And at some level, you may need nutrients to maintain that harvestable buffer. And this way, it allows that management without overdoing it, basically. And the raw manure also has E. coli challenges that can come with it. And so by utilizing compost or fertilizer, it reduces those risks. So again, I mentioned site-specific buffers when I talked about the 10% slope and the 100-foot setbacks. But we can also look at, for some reason there's a situation where this doesn't make sense. Or the opposite is that these buffers are insufficient. They're too small for the slope or management of the field. We can also talk about doing wider buffers in some areas. For management of mortalities, this hasn't changed, but we basically have said that within 48 hours, you have to deal with it, and you can't just leave it there on the surface. So compost it, bury it, or send it to a renderer. And then there's also standards for composting of imported food processing residuals. And we basically went through and aligned where we could animal composting and on-farm food processing composting to have similar setback distances. And those were aligned with the solid waste management rules at DEC. For livestock exclusion, we have an example here to show you a little more clarity. But basically, in the production area and immediately to, animals should not have access to surface water except if they're going to cross. However, they could have a prescribed management plan, rotational grazing plan, that shows that they're interested in doing a high level of management of the cattle and can have the cattle have access to the stream so long as they keep 3 inches of grass all along the stream. Outside of the production area, livestock can't have access to the stream if it's unstable or if the Secretary has said that it's too risky, the situation isn't good, and that the livestock really need to be taken out. As far as they can still have access across at a crossing, they might still be able to access it for drinking, but just unrestricted access would be maybe the change that is required. This happens, for instance, a site that is truly unstable, it's an alluvial fan, that might be a place where we say, you need to take the animals out. We can work on setting up alternative watering sources and define a crossing area. So here we have an example to define what this is. And just one clarification that we did add. For the 3 inches of growth, we set the same buffer distance as the other buffers we just described. So 25 foot along surface waters and 10 foot along streams. But that is specific to in the production area. So here's a picture of a farm with streams going through it. You can see this area here that I just put in red is sort of the heavier use area. It's defined as part of the production area where the animals have access regularly outside. And then there's the driveways, the barns, the feed bunks, the manure storage. All of these other areas are also included in what we define as the production area. There it is. The animals may come from that production area and access the pasture across the stream year-round. So saying that there is no fence right now in this example. However, the pasture to the right is something that in the summertime they access. It's not unrestricted ability to go there all year round. It's a little bit more managed. So in this scenario, you've got 2 segments. One we've defined as the production area pasture, and the other is just pasture outside of the production area. So you can see we would require fencing in the production area pasture, but in the pasture itself, we wouldn't require fencing unless there was erosion present or there was enough risk that the animals were causing enough impact that we said that there's a water quality issue and we'd like a fence to be put up. And again, they can still have crossings, they can still have watering facilities. Those are things we do not want to restrict because the livestock do need that. But we would certainly work with you and prefer if you could get off-stream watering through tubs and pumps, and if you can make the crossings as minimal, so not a large number of crossings, just the needed amount. If you wanted to manage that, say you didn't have a large number of animals, you weren't creating a major resource issue, and you thought you could manage keeping enough grass there, you just kind of let them out for exercise once in a while, then you can have a grazing management plan that allows you to keep 3 inches of growth in that buffer area and not put up a fence. So sort of a different track here, one of the requirements from Act 64 was that the Agency of Agriculture certify custom applicators. And so this is a process that we're going to engage in over this winter of training custom manure applicators to be certified by the Secretary, demonstrating that they know about these regulations, also medium and large farm, which essentially all boils down to all of those, if you recall, have to follow the 590 standard. We'll work with them to understand things like the setback distances that are required, how to read a nutrient management plan. And then a custom applicator can train their employees. They don't have to have their employees that are seasonal get trained However, we will certainly encourage, and just past experience, when farmers were offered an opportunity for just an educational course on this, not specific to being certified, like 90 or 100 folks showed up for a 2-day course. So I think that you'll see that a lot of the employees, as well as the farm owners and applicators, will all want to be trained through this process. The certification will be for 5 years. And again, this is not for a farm who spreads their own manure. This is for someone who does it as a service and gets some benefit back. So it is someone who's in a business of doing manure application. When we, remember I said that all farms, small certified farms, medium farms, and large farms all have to get education 4 hours every 8 years. That will include, obviously, some of the core components that we're talking about with these same custom manure applicators. But for these applicators, they have to get a certification, and they also then have to do sort of continuing education, so 8 hours of training every 5-year period to keep up their status. So we'll sort of have 2 tracks where we have the custom manure applicator training certification program, and then we'll also have farm education and training that doesn't necessarily require a certification, but the farms are either certified or permitted through the Agency of Agriculture. When a farm wants to build a structure that is defined as a farm structure, so obviously a barn or a manure pit, these types of traditional infrastructure on a farm, the current standard is they always need to go and talk to the town and tell the town what they're going to build, show them a sketch, and they don't have to get a permit from the town, but the town needs to be able to have on file a record of what they're doing. Should the use of that structure ever change and become, you know, it was a barn, but now it's a 2-bedroom apartment, the town needs to understand what was originally the design and structure of it, and other associated infrastructure that may have gone with it, say a septic system or something to that effect, which would be permitted by DEC if you do that. But anyways, construction of farm structures in flood hazard areas or river corridors, they're required to obtain a permit from ANR to do that. You cannot build in a floodway, but in floodplains, if you can show that you're not going to impact the floodplain and can adequately protect the building, then you may be able to receive a permit to build that. But all of that needs to be approved, and the process is you work with the Agency of Agriculture, and then the Agency of Agriculture works with ANR to help you through that process. One of the other things is that when you go and work with the town and show them your sketch, they have the maps, the floodplain maps. They know their local setback variances. They have a lot of information and resources at the town level. And they can give you a heads up of where you're not meeting setbacks or where you're proposing to put something might be in a floodplain. That information is super helpful because then it helps, if you need a variance, it gives us the right information to be able to understand what the minimum requirements are, what you want to do, and it allows us to look whether there are other alternatives. Where there are not alternatives, we have the ability to allow a variance. However, we take those really seriously because these are long-term impacts that need to be managed going forward. However, just given the nature of change, some of these farms were definitely in place before all of these requirements were ever considered. So we wanted to be mindful of that. For waste storage facilities, we've outlined some specific requirements of where these can be sited. And you can see it's 100 foot from the center line of a public road, 100 feet from a property line, 100 feet from the top of bank of surface water, and 200 feet for public or private wells. And that is mainly to be able to, one, have the space between surface water, for instance, and the waste storage facility to reduce the risk should there ever be an issue. And then also on the nuisance side, management of these infrastructure has a lot of activity around it, and to be able to give enough separation distance between neighboring properties and this structure. So one just last thing that the agency was given the authority is that if we look at a farm and see that the RAPs say this draft is finalized, and we go and we look at your farm and you're doing all of these things, and it's, however, you've got still issues. Say you might have, your buffers may not be sufficient and there's sediment loading into the buffers and reaching the stream because of the slope of the land. we can then say the RAPs, the minimum requirements that are in the RAPs are insufficient, and you then need to do whatever. So in that instance, you could see the field down if you were so inclined to do. You could just extend the buffer and make it wider so that it satisfies keeping that sediment from reaching the stream. And so we'll work with the farmer to figure out what the right practice is for that farm. But the whole concept is that if the RAP standard is not sufficient, then we can require a higher standard. You can see here, this is the end of the presentation. This is the email address should you have any comments about this draft. And it's the same address that we have used in the past. Our website is an enormous resource of information, and definitely encourage you to go there and check it out. And there's a shortened version of the website link if you can't remember the long one. So at this point, what we'd like to do is open it up for any questions. If you can type messages, then we can read them off and answer them for the group as a whole. First question that I see is how many farms are in that smallest group? There's 7,000 farms total. So deduct 1,500 and, oh, the non-SFO group? Oh, is that the question? The smallest group. I guess if that person could help clarify their question, that would be great. But the municipal group, unknown. Essentially, most of those folks are probably not reporting in the census that they have, you know, a horse or two, or a couple of sheep, or whatever their operation is. So it is unknown, really, at the statewide level, how many farms fall into that municipal group, the non-RAP group. And then we outlined 5,500 was in the RAP group. The smallest acreage group. I'll have to get back to you on the acreage numbers, but I think getting at the vegetable and annual cropland, the RAP group there, that's all inclusive, right? The 5,500 is all inclusive. Yeah. Okay. So thank you for responding that we've answered your question. Yes. So the 5,500 number, all of those numbers were all types of farming operations, not specific to livestock or vegetable or annual cropland. So the next question, what are the consequences of non-compliance with a plan that was developed? For example, I cleaned the barn out and it rained unexpectedly and had a fish kill. So, you know, these are all depending on the nature of the situation. If what you did when you cleaned it out was compliant with the RAPs, and there was an impact such as this, depending on how it, you know, the nature of it was, if it was indirect but it happened, you know, we would likely tell you you need to do something different. That's where that we can require a BMP essentially. So maybe help you put in some storage place to be able to stack the barn clean out material. If, for instance, where you piled that when you cleaned out the barn was literally on top of a stream and direct discharge, you know, that's something we refer, and we have to refer over to the Agency of Natural Resources. And if it was that direct and that impactful, it likely would come with a penalty. And again, you still have to be required to do a best management practice. So the recommendation is, you know, obviously common sense, good management, follow the setback distances that are outlined in the RAPs. But certainly if you think your site has more risk and those RAPs are the minimum and you need to do more than that, you know, do that rather than us coming to your farm and having an impact to the environment to tell you to do more. Another question is, curious about what the process for Section 4.2 might be, which Section 4.2 is where the Secretary can ask a farm, I believe, to move up in the process, where we're saying that a farm, where we can take a farm out of okay, so when a farm is certified, there's a process, and I didn't mention this in the presentation, where they can ask to be put down a category, essentially, to be a non-certified but still following the RAPs. That process there requires, we can hear out your case, and where there's not a threat of a discharge to water quality, we can approve that. And so some instances that come to my mind when I think about that is we've seen in the past where there's a poultry operation completely enclosed within a building, and all of the manure from that operation is exported out of the watershed or out of state. You know, they don't utilize the nutrients on land that's associated with that farm. Something to that effect may be where the risk is zero because they're exporting and they're not having an impact, that we could drop them down a category and not make them annually certified. So that's an example, but you know, there's, in this line of business, I've learned that you can't come up with enough examples for the things that you're really going to find out. But the goal is that where you can clearly show that there isn't an impact, that we could give people the opportunity to be alleviated from some of these requirements. Okay. Here's the next question. With regard to field stacking application or exporting, if you have a single active pile, like a windrow, wherein you are actively applying finished compost into your field and adding raw material that does not constitute land applied, in other words, there is a constant pile, but it is constantly being added to and taken from. And so basically, an actively managed pile is fine. What we don't want to see is when we, you know, the 2-year standard is essentially we go back out there and the material hasn't moved, you've got massive weeds growing out of it, and when it rains, you've got trails of dirty water running from it. That's a very different situation than something that is actively managed, added to, and subtracted from. That's very different in my mind. What we're saying in that standard is that it is not actively managed, it has not been moved, and it's been sitting there for more than 2 years. We want to be able to say you need to do better management and treat it more like a windrow and something more actively managed. Are there any other questions? Here we go, got one. With over 7,000 farms in Vermont, who is going to develop and review all of these plans and enforce them? So again, this is one of the reasons that we separated and created a different definition of non-RAP, RAP for small farms, and certified RAP. Right now, for the medium and large farms, there are consultants who are working with them and writing plans, and that piece is covered. The basic increase in this whole draft is that there's 1,500 new farms that are going to need some kind of plan. A portion of those are likely to already have something in place because they've either done it because they've found the value in it themselves, or they've utilized USDA cost share, which requires, if you're doing a waste transfer or a waste practice, that you have a 590 nutrient management plan. So there's, of the 1,500, there's some portion that will need the plan. There's two RCPP grants actually that have gone out and are actively engaged right now in getting farmers in courses through UVM Extension and the Vermont Association of Conservation Districts to write their plans. So there's an active movement to get the soil testing, get the manure testing, get farmers into classes so that we can work on this process. One thing that we did clarify in this draft that I don't believe we had in the presentation was, what if a certified applicator shows up at a farm, let's say a small farm, because medium and large already have to have nutrient management plans, but a small farm, one of these 1,500 that's supposed to have a nutrient management plan, but they don't have it yet. And maybe it's a resource limitation that they're waiting to get access to cost share or the class or whatever it is, or their consultant that they've hired hasn't had the capacity. What we've said is that, because the custom manure applicators didn't want to be on the hook for then, you know, one, either saying, sorry, have a good day, I can't help you, when the reality is I think we all recognize the landscape and the management of that manure is an important aspect for the crop that they want to grow. But the other is there's a relationship there between the business, and they've been doing it maybe for 20 years for that farm, and to then all of a sudden just have a change. And so what we've outlined is that if you're taking soil tests and you're entering the information, there's typically a rate that's suggested in the nutrient recommendations on that soil test. So at least utilizing that would be step one. The 590 nutrient management plan has other tools in it, running a phosphorus index, running a nitrogen index, you should already have your erosion figured out. So it's not 100%, but at least you're utilizing the 80% of the tools that exist to make good decisions on nutrient applications. And that's what we're saying is you should contact the Agency of Agriculture to let them know that you're going to be applying on a farm, because remember, these operators will be certified. To contact us and say, I went to Joe's farm. Joe doesn't have his nutrient management plan. He's got XYZ going on, which is why he doesn't have it, and I'm going to make an application based on his soil test. And just that acknowledgement there and our understanding where Joe is in the process will help us be able to understand, A, whether we need to put additional resources into making sure that we help farmers if there's a real backlog there. But it also lets us know that Joe's doing something and he's tried. And it keeps the certified applicator from being held liable for a decision where he's trying to make the best choice. The next question is, great website. It has been easy to find updates and archive materials. Great. That's not a question. That's a compliment. Thank you. Are there any other questions? Well, so just a reminder again, this draft is out. We are meeting with people in small groups, but we are going to do those major hearings. The format of the hearings will be different than any of the meetings that we have done in the past. If you had come to an RAP meeting, it will be much more structured. We'll give a presentation to explain what the draft is, and then we really want to focus on getting time for people to give us comment. That's the whole point of these hearings. Again, we'll have a microphone set up, we'll have it recorded, and it is a chance for you to go on record so that we have this public discussion about this proposed draft. So we did get another question. The 590 standard and the concept of T is a soil health standard, not necessarily any guarantee of water quality protection. What happens when waters are still impacted? So this has been a long-running discussion on the national level and also on the state level. The T value is about crop productivity and soil health for that crop productivity. However, it can be translated to water. And there are issues where, say for instance, and this is where that if the RAPs are working and there's still an issue, we can require an enhanced practice. And so if you're meeting T based on all the erosion calculations and we look at everything, but all of us can stand there and say, it's still not working, you still see lots of erosion, you see vegetation leaving the field. Sometimes we've seen where it crosses to a property boundary, maybe not even water. That's where we can say you need to do more, and the practices that typically go with that might be adding a cover crop in or having a longer grass rotation, doing no-till corn if they're doing corn. There's a lot of practices that can be put together in a plan to minimize the amount of erosion. So I encourage people, I know that when we show up at that meeting, or the hearings rather, it's really a time for people to comment. If people are confused prior to that meeting or need clarification, please reach out to us, ask questions, especially if for some reason you're someone who works with a lot of farmers and want to help relay information and educate. We are happy to help. Myself and Ryan Patch can be reached, and Jim Leland as well. Any of us, anyone from the Agency of Agriculture, reach out to us, because the more we clarify ahead of time, the better comment we feel we can get. And we really want to get good comments so that we get this right. We're really trying to strike the balance of finding something that really pushes water quality in the right direction, but also is meaningful and useful to the ag community without being too burdensome. All right, last call for questions. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. This will be our last webinar. They were both recorded. They'll be on our website if you feel like you need to have another version of this. But again, we'll see you hopefully at the public hearings. And again, the website's the place to keep up to date on all of that. So thank you very much.